The woman remembered by history as Joan of Arc was born around January 6, 1412, in the small village of Domrémy, located in northeastern central France. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy, were farmers who owned a moderate amount of land. In addition to managing the family farm, Joan's father also served as a local tax collector and was a member of the village watch. Their farm was situated in territory sympathetic to the Duke of Burgundy, who was aligned with England, France's primary adversary at the time. Despite this, Joan's family, like much of the French peasantry during the 100 Years' War, remained loyal to the French monarchy. This loyalty was partly driven by the brutal tactics employed by the English forces, who frequently pillaged and set fire to French villages, towns, and cities, creating widespread resentment among the French population. Joan herself experienced this hostility firsthand, as her village was raided and burned on several occasions during her youth. These traumatic events likely played a role in shaping her future actions and motivations. The origins of the 100 Years' War date back to 1328 when King Charles IV of France died without leaving a male heir. King Edward III of England laid claim to the French crown through his mother, Isabella, who was Charles IV's sister. However, the idea of an English king ruling France was unacceptable to the French nobility, who asserted that the French crown could not pass through a female line. Consequently, Philip of Valois, a grandson of King Philip III, was proclaimed King of France. In response, Edward III launched a military campaign to seize the French throne, a claim that his successors continued to assert, thus prolonging the conflict. By the time of Joan of Arc's birth, the 100 Years' War had already been ongoing for nearly 75 years. Edward III had died in 1377, shortly after the death of his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, who succumbed to dysentery. The English crown then passed to the Black Prince's young son, Richard II. However, Richard's youth and lack of authority made him vulnerable, and after a series of political crises and uprisings, he was overthrown and ultimately murdered. The key figure behind this power shift was Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, Earl of Lancaster, and another grandson of Edward III. Bolingbroke was subsequently crowned as Henry IV. This turmoil sowed the seeds of the English Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between the Lancastrians, descendants of John of Gaunt, and the Yorkists, who descended from Edmund of Langley, the fourth son of Edward III and the first Duke of York. During Joan's early years, England's dominance over large swathes of northern France seemed more entrenched than ever. In 1415, just 3 years after her birth, English forces led by Henry IV's son, Henry V, achieved a decisive victory over the much larger French army of King Charles VI at the Battle of Agincourt. This triumph further solidified English control, making the political and military landscape in which Joan would eventually rise to prominence even more complex and fraught with tension. The French monarchy found itself in a dire position after the Treaty of Troyes was signed in 1420. This treaty forced King Charles VI to recognize Henry V of England as his rightful heir, effectively sidelining his own son, the Dauphin Charles. To further solidify his claim to the French throne, Henry V married Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois. This union would later have far-reaching implications, as Catherine would go on to marry Owen Tudor after Henry's death, becoming the grandmother of Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor, later known as Henry VII, would ultimately defeat King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, concluding the Wars of the Roses with a decisive Lancastrian victory. However, just 2 years after the Treaty of Troyes was signed, Henry V succumbed to dysentery in his mid-30s. His death was quickly followed by the passing of Charles VI of France, leaving Henry V's 1-year-old son, Henry VI, to inherit both the English and French crowns. This situation proved untenable for the French nobility, who refused to accept an English king ruling over France. Instead, they rallied behind Charles VI's surviving son, also named Charles, who laid claim to the French throne. Known as the Dauphin, a title reserved for the heir to the French throne, Charles was Catherine's brother, making him the uncle of the young King Henry VI of England. At this time, the English maintained control over much of France through a strategic alliance with Philip, Duke of Burgundy. This alliance was cemented by mutual interests and personal grievances. Philip had aligned with the English after his father, John the Fearless, was assassinated during a meeting with the Dauphin Charles. This betrayal deepened the conflict for the French, who now faced two formidable adversaries. However, a significant turning point in the Hundred Years' War would come later, in 1435, when the Dauphin Charles, by then Charles VII, and Philip of Burgundy reconciled their differences and joined forces against the English. During the minority of Henry VI, the English regency in France was overseen by John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's brother. Bedford, a skilled and experienced military leader, managed Henry VI's affairs and maintained English dominance in northern France, including Paris. His marriage to Philip of Burgundy's sister further strengthened the alliance. Meanwhile, Charles VII was forced to retreat to the southwest, establishing his power base in strongholds such as the castle at Chinon. Overwhelmed by the strength of his enemies, Charles found himself largely paralyzed, unable to mount significant resistance. Amid this turbulent period, Joan of Arc experienced a pivotal moment. Around the age of 13, while sitting in her father's garden, she claimed to have had a vision of celestial figures, which she identified as saints like Michael and Catherine. These visions instructed her to take up arms against the English, drive them out of France, and help install the Dauphin as king. At 16, she persuaded a relative to accompany her to Vaucouleurs, where she sought an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the local garrison commander. She requested an armed escort to travel to the French court at Chinon and advise the Dauphin. Baudricourt initially dismissed her, but Joan returned the following year, displaying remarkable persistence. She proclaimed, "I must be at the king's side. There will be no help unless it comes from me. I would rather have stayed spinning wool by my mother's side, but I must do this because it is my Lord's will." Her unwavering conviction eventually swayed several soldiers. During a second meeting with Baudricourt, Joan made a startling prediction. She foretold that the French forces would suffer a defeat near Rouvray, north of Orleans, where they were attempting to intercept an English supply column. This prediction, which soon proved accurate, began to convince others of her divine mission. The Duke of Bedford had strategically ordered his forces to lay siege to Orleans, recognizing its crucial significance. As one of the largest cities in France and a key crossing point over the Loire River, Orleans served as a vital gateway to the southern territories of the country. Initially, Bedford had no intention of capturing the city, but he changed his mind based on advice from the Earl of Salisbury. Consequently, English forces surrounded the fortified city on October 12, 1428, encircling it from the north bank of the Loire. With this maneuver, the city's only remaining link to the outside world was a 400-meter bridge that extended across the river to the southern bank. At the southern end of this bridge stood a turreted gatehouse known as the Tourelle, which the English captured on October 24. This effectively cut off Orleans from external supplies and communication, leaving the city isolated and vulnerable. Its imminent fall seemed certain, a collapse that would also severely jeopardize the Dauphin's chances of securing the French throne. When news of French setbacks near Orleans reached Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander at Vaucouleurs, he finally agreed to provide Joan with an armed escort to the royal court at Chinon. Disguised as a man, Joan embarked on a perilous journey through Burgundian-controlled territory. For years, rumors and prophecies had circulated about a maiden in armor emerging from the Lorraine region, Joan's birthplace, to save France from the English. Whether Joan capitalized on these tales is uncertain, but they undoubtedly bolstered her credibility in the eyes of the French court. The Dauphin, Charles, had heard of Joan's visions and predictions and decided to test her authenticity. He disguised himself as one of his attendants, hoping to remain unrecognized. However, upon entering the chamber, Joan unerringly identified him. She threw herself at his feet, embracing his knees and exclaiming, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." This moment astonished onlookers, as Joan had never met Charles before. In their subsequent private conversation, Charles later reported that Joan revealed details only he could have known, personal thoughts he had expressed solely in silent prayer. Convinced of her divine mission, the Dauphin found a renewed sense of hope and determination, which had been absent in his previously bleak outlook. Meanwhile, Charles's mother, Yolande of Aragon, had been assembling a relief force to aid the besieged city of Orleans. Joan passionately pleaded with Charles for permission to join this expedition. He granted her request, and she was outfitted with donated armor, a horse, a sword, and other necessary equipment. Leading a small entourage, Joan set out with the relief force, which comprised around 500 soldiers and essential supplies for the city. The force departed between April 27th and 28th, resembling more of a religious procession than a conventional military column, with Joan at the forefront. In addition to her leadership role, Joan sent messages to the English garrison encircling Orleans. She warned them to leave in the name of God, or she would drive them out by force. Although Joan had initially intended to approach the city from the north, through English-held territory, the convoy's commander, Marshal Jeanne de Brosse, opted for a different strategy. Without informing Joan, he decided to approach from the south, ensuring a safer passage for the relief effort. Upon discovering that she had been deceived about the route to Orleans, Joan of Arc was furious and immediately ordered an assault on the nearest English positions. However, she was ultimately persuaded to prioritize the urgent task of resupplying the city. On the evening of April 29th, under the cover of darkness, she accompanied the supply convoy into Orleans by boat. Once inside the city, Joan worked to uplift the morale of its citizens and defenders, parading through the streets and distributing much-needed provisions. In the following days, Joan engaged in intense discussions with the French commanders regarding their next course of action. These debates were heated, reflecting differences in strategy. After the city's commander, Jeanne of Dunois, departed to gather reinforcements, Joan took the initiative to inspect the English fortifications personally. During this reconnaissance, she exchanged words with enemy soldiers, including William Glassdale, one of the English commanders at the Tourelles. Dunois returned on May 3rd with reinforcements, whose arrival was unchallenged due to their overwhelming numbers. The next day, he led an attack on one of the English bastions to ensure the safe passage of an additional supply convoy. Joan, unaware of the assault as she was asleep, quickly joined the battle upon awakening. The attack proved successful, bolstering French confidence. 2 days later, the French leadership decided to focus their efforts on the English positions south of the Loire River. They launched an offensive on the English fortifications but were ultimately repelled. During this period, Joan personally led an ill-fated assault on one of the bastions. The attack faltered due to intense arrow fire, and she was wounded in the process, requiring her to be carried away from the battlefield. According to legend, as the English forces pursued the retreating French, Joan turned and cried out in the name of God. Her rallying call inspired the French soldiers to regroup, turning the tide and forcing the English back into their fortifications. Despite her injuries, Joan rejoined the French forces the next day and participated in the assault on the Tourelles. This critical stronghold fell to the French on the evening of May 7th. During the chaotic retreat, The English Captain William Glassdale drowned when the drawbridge connecting the Tourelles to the main English fortifications collapsed under the weight of fleeing soldiers. The battle was devastating for the English, who suffered nearly 1,000 casualties and had around 600 men captured. With the Tourelles in French hands, Orleans could now be resupplied with ease from the southern bank, rendering the siege untenable for the English. In light of these developments, Lord Talbot, the overall commander of the English forces, ordered the demolition of their siege positions and prepared his troops for a final confrontation. Some French commanders advocated for an immediate attack to crush the retreating English army, but Joan forbade it, citing the sanctity of the Lord's Day, as it was a Sunday. Consequently, the English forces withdrew westward toward Meaux without further engagement. Joan's pivotal role in lifting the siege of Orleans earned her widespread fame across France and even in England. Although her arrival coincided with a broader shift in French tactics toward a more aggressive stance, there is little doubt that her presence had a profound impact. Joan's leadership and unwavering faith inspired the city's defenders, invigorating both soldiers and civilians and solidifying her reputation as a symbol of French resilience and divine intervention. The next significant challenge that both Joan and the French faced was the destruction of the bridge connecting Orleans with the southern bank of the River Loire during the recent battles. This created an urgent need to secure alternative crossing points across the river, essential for supporting a northward advance and preventing any potential English incursions into the southern territories. The English had fortified 3 critical bridges across the Loire at Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. To regain strategic control, the French resolved to recapture these bridges. This effort marked the beginning of Joan's first offensive victories, heralding the French army's initial successes against the English in over a generation. The campaign began with the recapture of Jargeau on June 11, 1429, followed by the victory at Meung-sur-Loire on June 15, and finally the triumph at Beaugency on June 18. These victories inflicted substantial losses on the English forces, compelling them to consider sending reinforcements under Sir John Fastolfe to counter the resurgent French army and support the retreating English troops led by Lord Talbot. However, by this time, the French forces significantly outnumbered their English counterparts. The English commanders, perhaps intimidated by Joan's leadership and the recent French successes, opted to withdraw toward Paris. The French, aware of their enemy's movements, decided to intercept them, culminating in the Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429. During this pivotal battle, the English attempted to deploy the same tactics that had brought them success at Crécy and Agincourt by positioning their archers behind stakes to mow down the advancing French troops. Talbot also tried to set an ambush by moving soldiers into a tree line along the road where the French forces were advancing. However, the English preparations were incomplete, and the French, led by around 1,500 mounted men-at-arms, overwhelmed them. The entire English army was routed, marking the most devastating defeat they had suffered in France in decades, with nearly 2,500 troops lost from a force of 5,000. Lord Talbot himself was captured during the battle, while Sir John Fastolfe managed to escape, returning to England. Despite his survival, Fastolfe was made a scapegoat for the catastrophic defeat. The consequences of the Battle of Patay were severe for the English. With most of their field forces in central France decimated, they were left incapable of mounting any significant resistance in the following months. Buoyed by this victory, Joan and the French army marched toward Reims, the traditional site for French coronations. Along their route, cities such as Auxerre and Troyes surrendered, and eventually, Reims fell into French hands. On July 17, 1429, Charles the Dauphin was crowned Charles VII of France in a grand ceremony at Reims Cathedral, a momentous event that cemented Joan's legacy as a national heroine. 2 months later, Joan and the French forces turned their attention to Paris, attempting to lay siege to the city. However, this campaign was unsuccessful, as King Charles ordered a withdrawal. A short truce followed between the English and French, but hostilities resumed in May 1430. Joan played a crucial role in defending Compiègne from a combined English and Burgundian siege. On May 23, 1430, during an attempt to attack the Burgundian camp north of Compiègne, the French forces were discovered, leading to a retreat. Tragically, Joan was unable to re-enter the city as the gates were closed, either in a panic or as an act of betrayal. Pulled from her horse by an archer during the ensuing chaos, she was captured and taken into Burgundian custody, marking the beginning of the final, tragic chapter of her storied life. Joan was initially held in the Burgundian castle at Beaurevoir, where she made several daring escape attempts. In one particularly desperate effort, she leapt from a 70-foot tower into the muddy moat below. Despite surviving the fall, she was soon recaptured and transferred to Arras. It was here that negotiations between the Burgundians and the English culminated in an agreement. Joan would be exchanged for a pro-Burgundian nobleman and a payment of 10,000 livres tournois, one of the currencies used in medieval France at the time. Now in English custody, Joan was taken to Rouen, the headquarters of the Duke of Bedford in France. Imprisoned in an octagonal cell, she was kept in chains with only a narrow archer's slit providing light. Her trial for heresy was orchestrated by a court composed of French collaborators loyal to the English and pro-Burgundian clerics, led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon. The English themselves avoided direct involvement in the proceedings to prevent it from being perceived as a politically motivated trial, which could bolster Charles VII's cause. Instead, having French officials oversee the process lent an air of legitimacy to their efforts. From January 9 to May 29, 1431, Joan underwent a meticulously structured trial designed to portray her not as a servant of God but as a heretic and witch. The English aimed to undermine her claims of divine guidance, which, if proven false, would cast doubt on Charles VII's legitimacy as king. The trial included intense cross-examinations intended to trip her up and reveal inconsistencies in her testimony. Over the course of 15 sessions, held between February 21 and March 17, 1431, Joan faced relentless questioning about her visions, the voices she claimed to hear, and even her choice to wear male clothing. Despite the overwhelming pressure, she displayed remarkable intelligence and composure. In one particularly famous instance, during the third session, Joan was asked a cunning question: "Do you know whether or not you are in God's grace?" This was a trap. If she answered no, she would effectively admit to being a sinner. If she said yes, she would be claiming to know God's will, a blasphemous assertion in the eyes of her accusers. Joan's response highlighted her extraordinary presence of mind. "If I am not in God's grace, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. I would be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in God's grace." This reply demonstrated both her humility and her profound faith, qualities that repeatedly confounded her well-educated prosecutors. Throughout the hearings, Joan consistently outwitted her interrogators, answering their questions with insight and resolve. Her ability to hold her ground against learned men of law, theology, and politics is all the more remarkable given her background as an illiterate farmer's daughter. Despite this, Bishop Cauchon proved to be a skilled and persistent interrogator. Gradually, he coaxed additional details from Joan, including accounts of visions she had previously kept private. The trial, though legally flawed and politically charged, showcased Joan's unyielding spirit and deep conviction, qualities that would ensure her legacy long after the court's final verdict. Joan was then held captive in the Burgundian castle at Beaurevoir, where she made several attempts to escape, one of which involved a daring leap of 70 feet from a tower into a muddy moat. However, after these failed attempts, she was transferred to Arras. There, The Burgundians and English reached an agreement to exchange her for a pro-Burgundian nobleman and a ransom of 10,000 livres de Tournois, which was a medieval French currency. Now in English custody, Joan was taken to Rouen, which served as the headquarters of the Duke of Bedford's forces in France. There, she was confined to an octagonal cell, shackled in chains, with only a small archer's slit to let in light. Joan was then subjected to a trial for heresy, overseen by both French collaborators loyal to the English and pro-English Burgundian clerics and lawyers, with Bishop Pierre Couchon leading the proceedings. The English were keen to avoid the public relations disaster of trying Joan themselves, as her trial could have been used by Charles VII as a powerful propaganda tool. Having French Burgundians preside over the trial was seen as more advantageous. From January 9 until May 29, 1431, Joan was interrogated in a series of hearings, where the prosecution sought to portray her as a witch and an agent of the devil, rather than a divinely inspired servant of God. If they succeeded in proving her heresy, they would also discredit Charles VII's claim to the throne, which was seen as being aided by dark forces, thus invalidating his legitimacy. The intricacies of Joan's trial and the series of cross-examinations she underwent could easily fill an entire video of its own. Throughout the 15 sessions, spanning from February 21 to March 17, 1431, Joan was probed on the nature of her visions, the voices she heard, and her choice to wear men's clothing. Despite being uneducated, Joan responded with composure and intelligence, consistently outwitting her interrogators, who were far more learned in law, theology, and politics. One memorable moment occurred during the third session, when Joan was asked a trap question: "Do you know whether or not you are in God's good grace?" If she had said no, she would have admitted to being a sinner, but if she had said yes, she would have been claiming to know God's will. Her answer was a testament to her clarity of mind. "If I am not in God's good grace, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in God's grace." This answer, full of humility and devotion, further showcased her resilience in the face of formidable intellectual opponents. Couchon, however, was a skilled interrogator, and over time, he was able to extract more details from Joan, including visions that she had never revealed before. One such vision was of angels delivering a golden crown to Charles VII at Chinon, which only Joan could see. This revelation was particularly damning in the eyes of Bishop Couchon, who was an expert theologian and knew that within the Church's teachings, angels and saints were believed to reside in the spiritual realm and not to take physical form. On the other hand, demons and devils could manipulate physical objects to tempt sinners. In the eyes of her accusers, Joan's claims of divine visions could easily be construed as demonic deception. The trial continued with a focus on Joan's cross-dressing, which she had done both to travel to Chinon in disguise and during her imprisonment. Some speculate that she wore men's clothing to avoid being sexually assaulted by her guards, as wearing a dress could have made her more vulnerable. Couchon questioned her, asking if God had commanded her to wear men's clothes, which was against biblical teachings. Joan responded by downplaying the significance of her attire, saying that the matter of her clothing was less than nothing. However, from the court's perspective, the Bible's prohibition of cross-dressing was an important point, and it undermined Joan's claims of divine legitimacy. The prosecution also focused on her visions and cross-dressing, ultimately concluding that these actions were enough to condemn her as a heretic. On May 24, 1431, Joan was brought to a scaffold next to a church at Saint-Ouen in Rouen and burned alive at the stake. Faced with the agonizing prospect of death, Joan recanted her claims of divine visions, submitting to the authority of the Church. She signed a pre-written confession, renouncing her actions and admitting that everything she had done was of her own volition, not inspired by divine intervention. This meant that the coronation of Charles VII was invalid in her eyes, as it was no longer seen as divinely ordained. However, after Joan was taken back to her cell, she retracted her confession and put on men's clothing again. This act rendered her previous confession invalid, and she was questioned once more by Bishop Cushion. It was suggested that after she had put on the women's clothing, she may have been assaulted by her guards, adding to her confusion and despair. Joan later claimed that she had recanted to save her life, but that God had visited her and told her that she had damned her soul to save herself. This claim sealed her fate in Cushion's eyes, and he immediately ordered her execution. On May 30, 1431, Joan was tied to a stake on a high pyre and burned alive in Rouen, at the age of just 19. As the flames engulfed her, she cried out the name of Jesus. After her body had been reduced to ashes, her remains were burned twice more to prevent her relics from being collected. Joan of Arc's life came to a tragic and brutal end, but her legacy would continue to inspire generations. After Joan's execution, her ashes were scattered into the River Seine. In the years following her death, the tide of the 100 Years' War began to turn in France's favor. Charles VII, the King of France, gradually regained control over the northern regions of the country, which had been under English occupation for decades. This shift was accelerated by key developments. Charles managed to mend relations with Philip, Duke of Burgundy, in 1435, leading to a powerful alliance between France and Burgundy against England. Furthermore, the death of the Duke of Bedford in the same year significantly weakened English leadership. Although Henry VI of England had been crowned King of France in 1431 at the age of just 10, the loss of Bedford's guidance left England unable to effectively defend its French territories. Without strong leadership and strategic unity, England's position in France became untenable. The internal conflicts arising from the War of the Roses further fragmented England, preventing the kingdom from mounting any large-scale military operations in France. This constant strife at home took precedence over foreign affairs. As a result, England's ambitions in France were effectively extinguished. France, which had once been on the brink of defeat, found new strength and resolve. It was Joan of Arc's leadership, courage, and inspirational presence that sparked the renewed French resistance and ultimately contributed to the reversal of fortunes in the 100 Years' War. 25 years after her death, Joan underwent a posthumous retrial, which cleared her of the charges of heresy. In 1920, almost 5 centuries after her death, the Pope canonized her as a saint. Despite the ongoing debate about whether Joan's visions were truly divine, there is little doubt that her role in lifting the siege of Orleans and her subsequent impact on the French war effort were crucial. Without her leadership, the French may very well have failed to win the war, and the course of history could have been dramatically different. Joan's rise from a humble peasant girl to a national hero and a key figure in one of the most significant wars of the medieval period is extraordinary. Her fame and legacy endure because of the incredible things she achieved in such a short time. Whether or not you believe in the divine inspiration behind her actions, there is no denying that Joan was a remarkable and courageous young woman who defied the societal expectations placed on women in her era. At a time when women's roles were largely confined to marriage and childbirth, Joan broke barriers and achieved something truly monumental.